It gives me great joy to introduce you to tonight's speaker, Ahdaf Soueif. In addition to being one of literature's leading lights, Ahdaf is one of the most respected voices in journalism and political commentary. Born in Cairo, she's the author of Aisha, Sandpiper, In the Eye of the Sun, and her best-selling novel, The Map of Love, was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize in 1999. She has published a collection of cultural and political essays, Mezzaterra, as well as a translation of I Saw Ramallah by Murid Barghouti. Ahdaf is also the founder of the Palestine Festival of Literature, PALFest. Ahdaf's most recent book, Cairo, My City, Our Revolution, was published last year and is her account of being on the ground in Cairo during the 2011 Egyptian Revolution. During this key moment of the Arab Spring, Ahdaf was in the thick of the action. Like many of you, I have watched these events unfold at a distance, and I'm really looking forward to a first-hand account of someone who was on the ground and can shed light on this complex situation. Ahdaf's dual experience as writer and citizen uniquely positions her to speak about the intersection between art and politics. It is this subject that she will be speaking to us about tonight in her Perth Writers Festival opening address on art and politics, supported by the McCusker Charitable Foundation. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Ahdaf Soueif.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for the welcome. And thank you very much for inviting me here in the first place. This is a beautiful city. It's my first time in Australia, and I'm looking forward very much to the rest of my time here once I've done what I have to do tonight. Okay, well, I hope that you will be glad to know that I don't actually have a lecture as such. Our experiences in the last 2 years have been so various and so fast and so fragmented that it really is very hard to place them in a sort of coherent lecture form. So what I have for you tonight is really more in the nature of notes from the front line of a revolution at the point where art and the revolution, or art and politics, intersect. And I'm actually eventually going to concentrate on the visual aspect of the arts of the revolution because, well, because how many Arabic speakers do we have here tonight? So I thought that, and in fact, actually, it is really the graphics, the graffiti, and to a lesser extent film, but certainly photography, that have really surged forward with the revolution. I think I should say, because there are people who call it a rebellion, people who call it an uprising, a spring. We insist on calling it a revolution because even though it has not actually managed yet to change facts on the ground, as it were, it has not seized power, it has not seen the country start to walk in the direction of the great aims of the revolution, the change that it has made has been in people's hearts and in people's psyches. And it's a change that nobody is going to undo and nobody is going to be able to walk away from. Because what happened was nothing less than a people rediscovering their own sense of agency, rediscovering that they can change things, that they can change the way that their country is run, that they can change their lives, that they have opinions and that their opinions matter, and that they have a vision for how they want to live. The issue, of course, is how you get from the vision to actual practical steps on the ground, and that's where we still are. But because the revolution took, because the revolution was so much about re-seizing agency, about articulating who you were and what you valued about yourself, what happened was that it unlocked, it sort of, it was like taking the lid off an entire people. And there was a great burst of creative energy. Obviously, not all of it, not even most of it is art. That's not what you expect. But there was an energy of action and an energy of self-expression that took various forms. In the 18 days that we were in Tahrir, which you must have seen and followed, it took the form of keeping Tahrir, and by Tahrir, of course, I mean all the different squares and streets in the country that were taking part in the revolution. Keeping it alive, keeping the sit-in solid, keeping it fed, keeping it clean, building bathrooms, providing electricity, providing shelter, blankets, setting up medical centers. So this was how it was expressed, but also, of course, to an extent, in what you could loosely call art. My first day in the revolution was actually the 28th. And the first thing I did was a march that went from Mbaba to Tahrir. But at one point I dipped out. And when I rejoined it, it was on 6th of October Bridge. And 6th of October Bridge was closed, and the whole city, of course, felt very eerie because all the action was in one place and the rest of it was empty, and there was tear gas. And so standing on this bridge, which actually runs like sort of 3 minutes from my home, and which I'm used to seeing completely jammed with traffic, and having it empty and filled with tear gas, was weird. And what was weirder was that suddenly in the middle of the bridge on the traffic island, there was a young man who was standing there with a brown paper bag on his head. And he was rotating very, very slowly. And as he rotated towards me, I could see he had 2 slits open for the eyes, and he had a big red question mark starting up at the forehead and ending with a dot where the mouth was. And he was rotating. And that was, I think, the first piece, and it was the first piece of spontaneous, if you like, street theater that I saw. And it was remarkable that this was a contribution that he decided to make at that point. The street and the Maidan were full of that kind of expression. At one point, that's of course when we were not fighting off the thug militias and the police and so on. At one point there were young people who had rigged up a huge wall of plastic, you know those transparent plastic folders that you put papers in and then you put them in a ring binder. This was a whole wall of them, and people would come up and tell them jokes, and they would write them, or they would draw cartoons and they would slot them in the pockets. And this whole wall of cartoons and jokes was being formed as we stood there. Or somebody would emerge from a tree with branches tied to his arms and just start doing a tree dance. Somebody had made, out of paper cups, had made a sort of aeroplane outline on the ground and was sitting next to it and saying this was the airplane that was waiting to take Mubarak away from the country. There was masses of that kind of thing. But looking at the work that is produced by people who perhaps think of themselves as artists, what did it look like? What was its function? And does it matter? Well, I think it does matter because the people have said that it matters. Because, for example, when the graffiti, which we'll see, I've got a slideshow for you, which we will get to. When the graffiti went up on Muhammad Mahmoud Street, for example, people came to see it. And when at a certain moment, I'll describe in the course of the presentation, it became almost like a place of pilgrimage. And people would just come and be in that street with the graffiti and would actually draw some kind of spiritual sustenance from it. The music and the songs became things that everybody knew and everybody said. I would say that the slogans of the revolution, the sort of one-line chants that people invented were, I would call them an art form, in that they took an experience to a level of abstraction that everybody could identify with. In my small way, I had an incredibly touching moment when a young woman came up to me with a copy of my novel, The Map of Love, in Arabic, and it was a pirated copy, which is fine by me, and it was full of post-it notes and squiggles and notes in the margins and drawings. And she told me that during the Cabinet Street sit-in, they had been reading the book and passing it round, and people were adding things to it, and that it kind of saw them through a few days. And that was, it was just incredibly touching and humbling. And actually, it stopped me saying or thinking that that what matters is action on the ground rather than fiction, because I do believe that action on the ground matters, and there are moments when it is incredibly urgent. But when the young people of the revolution sort of show me that, and then say, when is the next novel, then that kind of tells you something about art mattering. Well, the function. This is completely not theoretical and completely not prescriptive. This is what I have been, I've been trying to work out from what I saw on the ground, what I think, and what, speaking to each other, the people who are producing things, what we think the function of what we're doing might be. And one of them, I think, is creating a community, is putting out the experience, the collective experience, putting out that experience in a form that then becomes recognizable to everybody. And that way, creating a feeling that I'm not alone, that somebody saw this and depicted it in this way. Therefore, there is a common experience out there, which means that I'm not alone. Articulating feelings and ideas, and also telling the story. The narrative, as I'm sure you all know, is tremendously important. And what the narrative says and how it says it is radically important. Especially as always, of course, there are the powers that would seize the narrative and tell the story in a different way. And so to have voices from within the revolution telling their narratives is important, but also what's important is telling the story to ourselves. I guess we all know how people like, I mean, you know, the obvious example is a child who, you can always win a child over by telling him the story of his own day. You know, there was a little boy called whatever, and he woke up in the morning and did, and the more he recognizes that this is his own day that's being told, the more entranced he is. So not to say that, you know, that we're children, but to say that this thing of telling our own story to ourselves, which kind of consolidates our feelings about the situation we're in and about what we're doing. Okay, and I have another thought about function, but I will actually leave that to the end when you've seen some of the things that I would like to show you. What I have learned as well is that, okay, in Edinburgh in August, I spoke at the World Writers Conference, and I talked about the conflict between acting as a citizen and acting as an artist. And to put it in simple terms, during the revolution, as a citizen, you were really required to be on call, to do whatever you could, to add to the numbers by marching, to use whatever diplomatic skills you had to bring people together and try and push them to some kind of consensus, to run down at 3 in the morning and carry medical supplies to a field hospital, to ferry wounded kids to hospital, to provide transport for blankets for people who were sitting in, whatever. And you were always very up and down emotionally, because one day it all felt great and you were full of hope, and another day you were really sort of, you really had to dig deep to find that bit of hope. While if you're trying to be an artist and writing about things, then you can't be on call in that way. You have to have some distance, you have to have some space. For me, I put aside thoughts of fiction, and in fact, I would say that every Egyptian novelist that I know put aside thoughts of fiction, and we were all involved in writing columns. And we were using what skills we have as writers of fiction to write the columns. In other words, what you know about making a situation come alive, about the telling detail that will make people hooked into the story, about representing character in a way that will cause the reader to empathize with the character. You put that all in the service of reality, really. So instead of creating an imaginary world, which is what you do in fiction, you really believed that you were trying to create the world that we all imagined together, that you were trying to create it on Earth. And therefore, your job was to make reality as powerful and as engaging and as empathetic as you possibly could. And that's what you bent all your skill to. I remember talking to one of my fellow authors, Mohammed al-Makhzangi, whom I really admire. He's a great short story writer. And I said, your column last week was amazing, and there was this brilliant image in it. And he said, yeah, there goes another short story. Yeah. So but what I've learned is that your priorities have got to be very, very clear. And if you feel this way, then basically what you do is you act as a citizen. And if you're an artist, and if you're lucky, then something might come along which you will do and which will actually transcend the moment. But you can't go into political action looking for art. Neither can you force a political agenda on art. So it's kind of a balance that has to be kept all the time. And it's rather like being a day laborer. You know, you go out with your pickaxe or your shovel and you sit by the roadside, really, and you wait for what work is going to come your way today. And whatever work comes your way today, you do it to the best of your ability. You do it completely honestly. And maybe somewhere along the way, you'll be rewarded with an image or a sentence or a phrase that will actually cross over into the realm of the out of the ordinary. But what I've seen is that the motive all the time for the art that I have seen come out of the revolution, the motive all the time has actually been to support, to describe, to articulate, to advocate, to instigate. In other words, the motive has always been political and revolutionary, and that it's in that blurry, fuzzy area between the work that's born of activism and what is art that the most interesting things happen. So as I said, I'm going to limit myself to the visual. And what I want to do is I want to give you some examples of the kind of thing that I've been talking about and of the kind of processes, artistic processes that we have seen happening in the art of the revolution in Egypt, and a film clip. So I'm kind of limiting myself to graffiti and to a tiny film clip, two if there's time, one if there isn't. So I want to start with, now let's hope the technology works. And if any of my slides are wonky, please forgive me, it's not my strong point, and I've been really trying very hard right up until 5 o'clock to get them right. Okay, so here, okay, this is the Vendetta mask, of course. And that became very around the place. And here he's wearing it at the back of his head. This is very, very common now. And here, there's a whole group of them. Now here, these are people. This is the people, the revolutionaries in the street, using the body, as it were, as spectacle. Here, you can hardly see him, but there's a guy in pharaonic costume at the very top. This is recent. This is outside the presidential palace, in the recent protests outside the presidential palace. And this guy shows up to the protest where he's definitely going to be gassed and definitely going to be beaten and possibly going to be shot, but he's dressed in a pharaonic costume. And here, okay. Now, this was just before the referendum on the Constitution. And basically, the right thing to say was no. No to the Constitution. I'm just, you know, this is the crib sheet. Say no to the Constitution. And so here he is, underwater diving with a placard saying even the fish say no to the Constitution. This is a lot of trouble to go to, you know, a huge, and really it's because also there's, you know how if you have like a potent herb, you put it in an infusion and then you drink the water. So there's a saying when you say, oh, but what about blah, thinking it's very important. So the person who wants to tell you that it doesn't matter at all says, make it into an infusion and drink it. So that's what the placard is saying. He says, put your Constitution in this water and drink it. Okay, and now this is, this is spectacle despite oneself. This is sad. This is Ahmed Harara, a young dentist who was at the forefront of the revolution. The 28th of January, the day that I described seeing the young man with the paper bag on his head, on that 28th of January, Ahmed Harara was shot in one eye. And so he wore an eye patch with 28th of January written on it. And that became very kind of emblematic. 16th of November, the events of Mohammed Mahmoud Street, they shot out his other eye. And he has been a complete inspiration. He has been in every protest. He has, we are hoping that one day he will run for parliament. He is amazing, and he hasn't looked back once. Oh, sorry, this is, oh, what happens? I've lost my, here. So this is Ahmed Harara and the second eye. Now what happened also is, those of you who've watched Tahrir on the news will know that at one end of the bridge that leads into Tahrir, there are these two amazing lions. So here they are, the two lions of Tahrir, and they became very much appropriated by the revolution. So here you see this spectacle. Now, in the events of Mohammed Mahmoud, which we'll come to again, in November 2011, where Ahmed Harara lost his second eye, the army, the military, and the police were deliberately shooting at people's eyes. And so a lot of young people actually lost eyes at that time. The day after Mohammed Mahmoud, and you don't know who did it, but this is what happens. The street, and something happens. And that's the creation of a community, that everybody who looks that day up there knows what this is saying. And it's then picked up, and it becomes, of course, one of the images of the revolution that are picked up for meetings and for events and for concerts and so on. And eventually, sorry, I have lost, no. And eventually it becomes also graffiti, and the lion with the eye patch appears in all sorts of places, and a whole trope is created. Now, the next one is actually here. It's a piece of calligraphy that actually, it says, it has two words, Athawra, the revolution, and the other word in gold or orange, fan, art. And you could read it either way. You can read it Athawra fan or fan Athawra. Either the revolution is an art or the art of the revolution. And this is to say that people are conscious of the place of art in this revolution. And certainly the artists are conscious of what they're doing. The next slide, here. Now you can see the artist with his brush in the face of the military with the baton, and this is what it looks like when it's completed. And this theme is again and again articulated, whether it is the artist's brush or the words of the song, or somebody actually sitting and insisting on playing his oud, which is like a guitar, in the middle of the tear gas. Amazing spectacles. Now, here, this, if you noted, there is this the image on the left, top left there, yeah, which is what he was drawing supposedly to begin with. Here it is in big, and this is one half of the face. Sorry, the right half of the face is Mubarak, and the left half is Tantawi. Now you remember when Mubarak stepped down on the 11th of February, the army stepped in, and the field marshal, the head of the army, and the leader of SCAF, the Supreme Council of the military, was Field Marshal Tantawi. And they promised that they would safeguard the revolution and oversee the transition to democracy and so on. And we left the streets. It's hard to see what other option we had at that point, but anyway, we left the streets, and then the army proceeded to kill us. And for the following year, the history is a history of confrontations, escalating confrontations with the army. So pretty early on, this graffiti appeared, which basically shows that Mubarak and Tantawi are the same thing. And the legend underneath it says, "Illi kallif ma match," which is a take on an old proverb. But the proverb says, if you have kids, you're not dead. You don't die. And the take on it says, basically, yeah, if you hand over to somebody, you don't die. So Mubarak has handed over to Tantawi. Now look what happens here. After a while, the municipality or somebody comes down, of course, to erase, as they always do, to erase the graffiti. And then the people stop them, and it reappears. And now it's not just Mubarak and Tantawi, it is Amr Moussa and General Shafiq, who you will remember is eventually to run for president. Now, the new manifestation, the most recent manifestation of this same graffiti, with Morsi. And where? Not in Tahrir anymore, but on the walls of the presidential palace in Ittihadiyya. And for good measure, the next panel on the wall is Morsi as octopus, and also the image riffs off the Quranic verse that's above it, because the Quranic verse that's above it here says, He is the Lord, the Creator, who creates His creation in the most suitable form. And therefore, this is the riff on that. Okay, now, another thing that graffiti has been doing, a bit less recently because they've been darker times, but early on it was to sort of create in-jokes, so that, again, the community thing, that you read, you see it and you read it, and you know you're part of a community that sees this as a joke. Now, Mubarak, from very, very early on, was known as la vache qui rit. Now, la vache qui rit is, of course, it's a type of cheese, but it's also the smiling cow. And so this was like his nickname in the streets was la vache qui rit. And so as the revolution is gearing up, this graffiti appears in lots of places with the mark on it. And then here's another one. So basically, again, no legend, nothing, and this just appears everywhere. And whose pants are these? Well, they're clearly Tantawi's pants with the helicopter on them, and it becomes known as the Field Marshal's pants graffiti. Often, of course, probably most often, the graffiti was used to express a position or an idea. And of course, it's copied everywhere, or the artists themselves, because what they took to doing as well was to put out on the web the image or the stencil of it, and so everybody would download and reproduce. So this is one, for example, which was very popular, and of course one of the main ideas of the revolution was rediscovering our unity in our diversity, rediscovering Muslims, Christians. You know, this is the genius of Egypt, of course, that people have lived together for so long. That was one. And here, this is interesting, this is very recent. On the left is a journalist who was just killed a month ago, and he was very popular, very well respected. And on the right, never forget, and the names of the ultras, the 74 young men who were killed in Port Said Stadium at the beginning of February last year. But in the middle, this is the very first time that you have a homosexual motif with a positive message. I mean, not that you had them with negative messages, but there it is, and it says, the revolution is not homophobia. And that, I mean, I would have said that it was unthinkable until it appeared. This is one of the big things also that is happening, that people are opening up and talking about issues that had just been quiet for a very long time, and now it's all opening up. This is one of my favorites. I've just put it here because I couldn't bear not to. And here's where it goes into abstraction. You can see them. Oh, you can't see it very well, but they're like stitches. They're like sutures. So you've got the two eyes and the mouth, and I have to get a better image of it. Sorry. Okay. Here. Now, one of the things that the military have done, and that now Morsi's government is doing, is building walls all over downtown. And it was amazing. I mean, when we first saw them, it was like we'd been transported into Palestine. We couldn't believe they looked so like the Israeli walls. We think they've actually, copied them. And they've put wherever it's possible to break up the streets and to impede the movement of protests. They've put up these walls. And of course, they use them as cover then to attack from behind them. And in every instance, these walls have been appropriated and have been turned into various tableaus. So we could have run through 10 of these, but we're not going to, obviously. But I chose this because it's a ballerina. We've had tropical beaches, we've had rainbows, we've had submarines, but because this is art and the ballerina. Now, here, this is somebody, an artist, taking a common experience and representing it. And of course, the experience is that of being gassed. The tear gas experience was one that we are living through constantly. And then one day, when the tear gas comes, we're not alone. We have these tear gas angels on the wall. And here's another one. Okay, so this is responding to tear gas, and then often it's responding to a specific event. Now, I'm sure that a lot of you will have seen this coming picture, which was in December of 2012. Yeah, this is the young woman who was dragged through the street by the military with the Cabinet Street sit-in. She never came forward and revealed her identity, which I think was a really good idea, because she then became, again, very emblematic. And this event, there, and the blue bra with the no in calligraphy above it appears everywhere. You go through the city, you go to other cities, and once in a while you'll see the blue bra appearing on the walls. I want to move to film a little bit, because there's this really interesting experiment where a group of young filmmakers got together from the very first days of the revolution. Some of them were in Egypt already, others were Egyptians living abroad, others were half and half, but they were a group of friends, and they got together and they formed a collective, a film collective called Musirrin. What they did to begin with was simply to go out with their cameras and film what was going on. Eventually, they were doing training workshops for free, of course, for anybody who wanted to come and learn how to use a camera or bring material that they had shot with their mobile phone and learn how to edit it could come and be trained. They set up an archive which has now become the fullest archive of the revolution, and a copy of it is actually being kept abroad. Of course, they've been harassed, they've had their cameras broken, etc. Everything they do, they put out under Cultural Commons. They put out on YouTube. In January 2012, they were the most widely watched non-profit channel in the whole world. And they put out everything in 2 resolutions, in high resolution for people who want to download and screen off a projector, and low for people who just want it on the mobile. And they also fundraise through the net or through friends. They don't take money from, you know, establishments or governments or anything like that. And their work eventually became, okay, what they did was in May, when there was a big sit-in in Tahrir, now against the military, of course, they set up a screen and they started showing footage in Tahrir. So they just set up a screen, and with their projector and laptop, they started showing footage. And of course, because the state media was lying and colluding and so on, people from other cities had not seen what had happened in Cairo, and so they started bringing them their footage, and so they would screen that. And Tahrir Cinema became very, very much a sort of forum for the exchange of footage and for the exchange of ideas. Eventually, when there was a campaign against the military, their footage became the nucleus for that campaign. This is an image of Tahrir Cinema. And in fact, it really was, I think that first moment when they rigged up the screen and put some plastic sheets on the ground and started showing footage, and people started gathering and saying, what's this, and we were sitting on the floor. Very hot July night, and a way of keeping the sit-in going. Dangerous as it was probably the most romantic moment maybe of my whole life. That this was the moment when really, you know, the kind of artistic documentary work that people were doing was doing exactly what it needed to do and where it needed to do it. So this was Tahrir Cinema. And what I want to do here is I want to show you a 2-minute film. It's actually less than 2 minutes. It's like 1 minute and 40 seconds. I'm not actually sure how much to... Okay. This is, again, the events of Muhammad Mahmoud. At that point, there were 5 days of confrontation between the army and the revolutionaries in Tahrir, at one particular end of it, near Muhammad and in Muhammad Mahmoud Street, which then became very famous for this. And on the last 2 days, what the military would do was they would come down at, this was all to break up a sit-in. So they would come down at about 4 in the morning and just start shooting people. So it happened that this young man was shot, and his friends picked him up and ran with him for about 50 meters. And one of the filmmakers from Musireen was there, and he shot something. He shot this film, this 1.5 minutes, about sort of an hour after this had happened. And then he put on it the soundtrack of a young woman who had been splattered with the blood and who ran around sort of telling people what had just happened. Even if you speak Arabic, you won't really be able to make out what she's saying, so you're not missing anything. And this is why I think that this rises to a level of abstraction, which is very interesting. You will see some words coming up, and the words are the names of the other young men who were killed that day, so that this is no longer just about one boy. I think if it makes you catch your breath, if it makes you cry, if it speaks of something more than what it actually is, then it's art. And it just happened that somebody was there an hour later and put this together, and it was out there on YouTube within a couple of hours. And that day, the kids held the press conference that was to launch the campaign, They Lie, about the military. And this was the film that started it. Okay. It's going to get more hopeful, but it'll get worse for a minute. I'm sorry, there's just no way around it, really. But I will end on a good note eventually. But first of all, this is rough. This is where it all started, where this wave that led to the revolution started. This young man is Khalid Said. He was Alexandrian, a young IT guy, and he was killed gratuitously by Mubarak's police in June 2010, 6 months before the revolution. He happened to have on his, one of the things that was happening all the time was that people were filming transgressions and sending them out as mobile messages. So he had on his mobile phone clips of police officers cutting a drugs deal that had been sent by a friend. And he was beaten in a cafe in broad daylight and killed. And this was really the beginning of the wave that eventually became the 25th of January. It was the page that was dedicated to him, the We Are All Khalid Said page, that when it called for people to go out on the streets on the 25th of January, got something like 360,000 replies. And so the admins of 11 other pages met together, and this was the beginning. So this is Khalid Said, and this is the poster that got everybody going. This is after the police had finished with him. And then this was the sort of traditional poster that was made for him. And eventually a silhouette and a mask, and this is a performance that was, you can see clearly that was about him. This is his graffiti, which became completely recognizable, and it's appearing here on a pillar outside the Ministry of the Interior, just in the face of the Ministry of the Interior. This is again just before the revolution. And this is, you know, across the city, time to time, you would come across this. Now, another young activist, Mina Daniel. Khalid Said happens to be Muslim. Mina Daniel happened to be Christian, was very well loved, was a very active young activist, young revolutionary. And he was killed in the events of Maspero in October 2011. Now, we had had the stencil of Khalid Said, and we'd had, in fact, stencils of many of the other young people who were killed in the first months of the revolution. And so Mina Daniel immediately got a stencil, but Mina's stencil actually started showing decorative elements, new elements that had not been present in any of the stencils before. So, and going back, in fact, to ancient Egypt and to Byzantine influences. And then Mina became the first Shaheed, the first martyr, to be depicted full length. You can only see a bit of it here, but you can also see the poetry next to it. And this is poetry from Mahmoud Darwish, and that starts becoming a feature of the art on the walls, that it will also have poetry from various well-loved poets. And here, then, Mina appears with a group of his friends, all of whom have been killed, of course. I mean, so one of them is Khalid Said, another is Ali Meher, and so on. And so here there is a community of shuhada, of martyrs, being created and being used, actually, as inspiration, being used as fuel. And here somebody colors in their clothes, and then one morning we wake up, and there's Mina as an angel, with these huge, multicolored wings, and this is Christian iconography, Egyptian Christian iconography, which has been absent from public life, of course, for a very long time. Now, immediately, in the events of Muhammad Mahmoud as well, another person who is killed is the Sheikh Ahmed Aifat. He is a very well-loved academic at Al-Azhar University. He's the head of research and the head of the library, and he's shot point blank in Tahrir. And immediately, he starts getting a graffiti. At this point, actually, after Maspero, after the events of Maspero, when 27 Christians were killed downtown, one of them being Mina Daniel, a group of young artists from Luxor, two of them are actually teachers at the Institute, at the College of Fine Arts in Luxor. They came up to Cairo and they started painting. And this is one of them. So when Ahmed Aifat was killed, next day his graffiti started to appear. And this is freehand, and this is what it's like when it's finished. And Ahmed Aifat, the Muslim sheikh, now has the Christian wings, and he has verses from the Quran flowing out of his hand. And somehow this synthesis liberates something which enables these young artists to start going right back into the Pharaonic, into the Byzantine, into the Islamic, into the Persian, into every influence that has influenced Egyptian visual art. And Muhammad Mahmoud becomes the most amazing tableau of graffiti. So there, and there, and there. And this, you know, we could go on for 2 hours and we wouldn't finish the images that were created on that wall. Here's Persian. In February, the 1st of February, the Port Said massacre, which I mentioned, happens. And somehow, and people are still being tried, and the real people are not being tried, 74 young ultras are killed. The ultras have been very at the forefront of the revolution, particularly the ultras of the Ahli Club. 74 of them are killed at a football match in Port Said. And immediately, they find their place on the wall. And immediately, there's the iconography with the wings, ancient Egyptian motifs, and the black ribbon, and so on. There's the street. Now, my final point, I think, is that the graffiti artists have always said that their art is ephemeral, that their art is made for others to add to it, to make their own contribution to it, to modify it, and so on. And so quite soon, we start seeing them actually drawing on top of the graffiti. And what it is, they are actually writing something. And by now, we're heading for elections. And there had always been a question about the elections, about whether you should take part in elections under the aegis of the military, or whether the military, having now killed so many of the revolutionaries and proved their bad faith, were illegitimate, and you were actually legitimizing them by taking part in what was supposed to be a democratic process that they were engineering and supervising. The death of the 74 young men in Port Said swayed a great many people to not take part in the elections. And that is what this artist was doing, that he was actually starting to, the calligraphy, which eventually becomes a sort of satirical urge to forget about the dead and run to the elections. So that's what that does. But also you'll see that there's a big portrait of a woman there, and the woman is the mother. This is a very, very powerful trope, that we have the mothers of the young people who've been killed. They are incredibly strong, and you would think that every one of them was a rhetorician. They say that they have more, I mean, basically, a lot of them have adopted the young people of the revolution as their children, and their position is that don't give up and don't let up, and the dream that our children died for, make sure you bring it home. So they are very powerful, and yet, of course, there's pain. And I wonder whether perhaps that's another function of art in a revolution. I mean, I think I'm going to end with two functions that I think might be important. One is that through what you've seen and through the functions that we've talked about before, there's something like the Egyptian revolution was loved and well regarded because it was grassroots, horizontal, had no leader, and so on, open source, all these things. And as such, it seems to exemplify the way that young people in the world are operating. And it rejects hierarchical, pyramidal structures, which is part of the problem, part of the reason why the revolution has not been able to seize power, because nobody wants to buy into the notion of the pyramid structure and become a leader, as it were. So I don't know what we're going to do about this practically, but if what's happening is that the pyramid structure is being discredited and what is taking its place is a web-like structure where ideas hit here and there and light up and take hold and run along the web. Maybe that's one of the jobs of art, to become the link, to become the conduit, to become the conversation that happens, to become the synapses, connecting the bits of the web. And maybe another function, as we see from this particular image, is to, while expressing the collective, because it's art of the revolution, to remind us always that the collective is made up of individuals, and that the days, the lives, the pain of individuals has to be kept very much as well in our focus. And maybe art is better placed than many other things to do that. I'm going to leave you with a 3.5-minute film that is not miserable, and that was actually a film that was made, again, by one of the Musserrin guys, to instigate, to push people to go out on the streets on the anniversary of the revolution last year, 2012. And so it's called The People Still Demand the Fall of This Regime, and it is unashamedly propaganda, instigatory. I think it's pretty close to art, if not art itself. This is, sorry, the pain. And now, I don't know where I can be to get out of your line of vision. That's the radio and television building which was lying about us all the time. And these are the walls I was telling you about. This is from the 60s. will demand the fall of the regime. Thank you.